Hey yo, what it did, y'all? Let's get right into it. Let me pose you a question. Do you think trade is worth it? And now you might be thinking, well, worth what? Worth it. Is the existence of trade in your games worth it? What is it, you might ask? Pick your favorite answer, right? Whatever it may be, that's, worth. It doesn't have an assigned worth. It's a concept, right? This isn't an item where I can tell you that it will be worth precisely $3, right? The worth is something related to your sanity, your willingness to play the game, the enjoyment you're having, etc. Is trade worth it to you? Because the way that I see these conversations going about trade lately, it makes me feel like people don't think trade is worth it. At least in the vocal minority, right? I can't speak for the majority of players. The majority of players don't speak. Therefore, you'll never know, right? But I do want to use this video to talk a little bit about the problems with trade in games that have loot in them, right? And it's worth noting, I will also talk about the pros of trade. It's really clickbaity and cool to say oh, I'm just gonna talk about the problems and the problems and the problems. But the reality is that trade solves a lot of problems as well, right? Trade solves a lot of problems that I think it does not get credit for when you talk about it in the way that people talk about it, right? People never really talk about trade as the great savior that it is for a number of different reasons, including just adding different ways to play the game, quite frankly. So let's get ready to dive into it. Let's start by making a case for trade for a second, because I think even if you dislike the things that trade is currently doing to your gameplay in PoE2 or in other games, you'll resonate with this initial sentiment that you don't have the time to grind all this shit out, right? To some degree, there's just that really cool item that you want to drop, but it hasn't been dropping for you, and it would be oh so nice if you could just buy it, right? You're sitting there thinking, man, I've killed I don't know how many King of the Mists already, and I just have not gotten an Ingenuity to drop. Man, I would love to just buy an Ingenuity. Isn't that a great feeling? Knowing that, all your playtime didn't amount to nothing because you were able to, in fact, still get the item you were after. You just grinded in a different way. You had progression path number 2 instead of progression path number 1. This is the essence of what trade does for games like PoE2. Grindy games naturally people would prefer to have a way to dodge the grind. It's a commonly asked for feature in the First Ascendant, another game I'm a huge fan of. It was one of the things that really keeps Warframe together because it is an extremely grindy game, but you can trade for the cool things in the game to make the grinding a little less excessive, right? Trading does good things for these grindy loot-based games, because I posited this idea to some friends and we all kind of agree with this sentiment. I want to know if you guys agree with this as well, but I genuinely feel like if the game didn't have trade, the player base would nosedive overnight. Like, imagine PoE2, we get all this hype going in and whatnot, and then we find out 2 days before launch, yeah, so actually guys, there's no trade in the game at all. Everything is SSF. Ignoring the expectations that people might have from PoE1, I think people would go, that's a little ridiculous, right? Even games like Diablo 3 and Diablo 4 have trade, however limited they might be in scope. Trade is a way to make people who don't have 12 hours a day to play the game feel like they can make progress that's at least close to that. Ignore for a second what people who do have 12 hours a day can do with trade, right? A player who has 8 to 12 hours a day but no trade just might not be as efficient as somebody who gets 3 to 4 hours to play every night. That's all they get. They come home from work, they finish up stuff around the house, they play for a couple hours, they get ready for bed. They could get a lot done in that time with the assistance of trade. They can skip the things that they deem unfun in the process. That's what trade is for. Skipping the unfun to get to the fun. Now, this exact same statement can be used to form the counterpoint as far as why trade shouldn't exist, which is that you could argue that those unfun parts exist because of trade, right? If we think about gear drops or anything to that nature, I think it's pretty reasonable to presume, right? It might not be entirely true, but it feels reasonable to presume that a number of drop rates in the game are definitely tuned around the fact that they are tradable items. I'm staring directly at greater essences and omens when I say this, by the way. I think those have their availability very clearly tuned around the fact that in trade, they will do disgusting things. And the core gameplay of PoE2 in its design is trade. Therefore, these currencies that would be really cool for you to use are unfortunately turbo ass to get your hands on because they can be traded. And it creates this very interesting two-part nature of unfun around rarer drops, which is one, for things that could be used, again, talking about crafting currencies, you will find yourself thinking, well, the actual value of this item is so high, right? Some of these good omens are so high that there's no point in you ever thinking to use it. And now, you could say the same thing is true without trade, right? Without trade, it's very easy to perceive that something is rare and be like, ooh, I probably shouldn't use this quite yet because I might not see another one for a little while, right? Think, like the Titanite stones in the Dark Souls games, especially the ones that you use to upgrade boss weapons. Those are pretty rare. That is a commitment. You need to prepare yourself for the commitment that you're going to make when you do so. So maybe you don't send it immediately. But what happens, and on the second half of it, is that because of this monetary pressure, right? It's no longer just rare in the sense that I might not see one, but also there's somebody willing to pay me a lot of money to never actually use this thing. If I use it and it whiffs, I'm going to feel awful about it. If I use it and it hits, it's going to be great, but it's probably going to whiff. And when I whiff with it, I'm going to hate it. But if I just sell it, that other guy over there, he would love it. And I will get money, guaranteed value. Which applies trade friction on discovery. This is the term that I came up with internally a long time ago when describing the problem that I had with the Uber bossing system in PoE1. And funnily enough, I have the same problem with the difficulty system for bosses in PoE2. When there are price points attached to learning and experiences, it's really, really easy for people to talk themselves out of the experience, right? It's actually one of the reasons that I loved the Quest Eater and Exarch fights so much in PoE1. It gave you incentive to experience the fight at least one time, right? Eater and Exarch, they are not fantastic pinnacle of GDG design even in PoE1 level fights, but they are fights that give you something to do besides literally just full clear the screen and then spam your mana flask, right? It gave you something to do. We don't really have that same thing in PoE1 or PoE2, and that's a shame. Because I fully believe that people should get to experience the Arbiter fight, the breach bosses and whatnot. But why put a breach stone in and go find out about those fights when people are willing to pay you over a div, potentially even 2 div for the fight? What are you going to do? You're going to go in there. Remember, you're experiencing it, so you're probably going to die, especially because of some of these bosses in PoE2. There are just mechanics that, unless you've literally looked them up before, you would just straight up fall over and die to them. And that's very unfortunate. But you're not incentivized to go experience that part of the game, right? And this hasn't even gotten to the part where the Atlas tree makes you need to do that several times to even make that boss comparatively worth doing relative to what, other people are doing if they're farming that boss on div 4 for its best drops, right? The core of what we've landed at here is that trade It's both a way to play more game and to not play more game. So, is it worth it? Yes. It's a simple answer. It's 100% worth it. And it's not a player count thing, right? This is me speaking as a player. I'm not GGG, right? Obviously, if I'm GGG, I'm like, yes, 1,000 times yes. Give me all the players, right? Last Epoch added trade, and that's about what happened to it as well in terms of its player count. It got so many more players from the fact that the game was no longer exclusively a grinding game. You could, in fact, grind and then go buy to save a lot more grind. Some people just really like that. So if you're a business, obviously trade is the way. But even as a player, here's the reality, right? Nothing forces you to trade. Let me say that real clear, right? Nothing forces you to trade. If you don't like the way that trade impacts the game, don't fucking trade. It's that simple, right? And now, you might be in the group of people that I've seen in these Reddit posts that I've been reading over the past couple of days, like formulating opinions and whatnot. And I agree for the record with what I'm about to say, which is that the crafting loop in PoE2 sucks balls. But here's the question, right? Is it that it is objectively, individually horrible, or is it mostly just the fact that it's so inefficient compared to trade, right? Are we not being lied to that it is relatively efficient compared to what trade will get you, right? Because that was the thing in PoE1, is that eventually crafting systems in PoE1 caught up to the point where you were able to convince yourself that you could get something with essences worth not needing to trade for. Even though if I told you how many chaos or divines and essences you had spent, you would be sick, right? In your head, it's free money. You managed to untradeify your thought process around it because the system felt good enough to get you close to it, right? So, because this is a self-imposed, this is a mental block, I think trade is entirely worth it. If you don't want to deal with the mental block, don't trade, don't play trade. One of those options can definitely work for you. And you might be thinking, well, what if I'm a trade player who just doesn't like the way trade works anyways? Why are you in trade? Like, if you're playing the game because of trade, then you shouldn't really hate the way that trade works. You're going to hate functions about trade and complain about the infrastructure of trade, right? For example, right now, I'm going to spoil a little bit of free game because I just think it needs to be out there. It's also in a Reddit post and whatnot, so I don't feel too bad about saying it, but I was using it a little bit before that because it definitely made my gearing a little bit easier. But if you want to get gear and stuff and you're realizing that the things are suddenly all priced in one divine, it might actually not be worth one divine. Change the selling price from relative to exalted orb and see what people are actually selling it for outside of just the one divine. A lot of the time, it's not actually 65, 70 exalts plus. There's a ton of times where that offering is somewhere below 30, below 20, honestly below 10 even sometimes, because the divine ratio that it uses in game on the site is not matched up with what divines are worth on the currency exchange. No idea why that's not how it works, but that's a weird point of friction, right? You could look around on the economy and see all sorts of things are worth the divine and be like, Jesus fucking Christ, what do I do? And this isn't your fault, obviously. I'm just giving you game to get around this problem because there are tons of items that are priced below one div but are being sold at one div simply because of the way that the trade site is misleading you informationally, right? And there's a number of problems with the trade site. And if you're a trade player who likes trade but hates this, I understand, because it's some bullshit, right? But if you're not in that bucket, your complaint point usually can be solved by stop trading, ignore trade, play the game. Now, I do need to make one last little piece here before I wrap this video because it's bit longer than I really wanted this to be, but I completely sympathize with your disdain for the crafting system, right? I did not make a number of videos on this channel already talking about how bad crafting is just to sit here and admonish you for saying, I can't believe that the crafting is so bad that it's making me interact with this shitty ass trade system to feel like I can get anything done. No, I get that, right? There is nothing like pulling the slot machine and coming up with no rewards on 100 pulls, right? I completely understand it, right? But aim your frustration at that, not at trade. You see what I mean? Like, aim your frustration at the crafting system. That deserves a lot more criticism than it's getting. Just because I think it deserves so much criticism. It's not that people aren't criticizing it, by the way. I just think it deserves more criticism. I think it is genuinely atrocious. Like, barely better than the games of old levels of atrocious, right? Like, it's bad. But trade is doing its job. And trade is good for the people who it's supposed to be good for. Do not blame trade for the faults of the crafting system. Blame GGG for trying to play economy god by trying to preempt what the drop rates should look like for things. Blame GGG for being scared of what the game looks like when people start playing it with insane items, which we're already seeing, right? People are already making mirror tier items as I'm speaking right now. Someone's probably working on another one of these items that I've been seeing. So I wouldn't really panic too much about all that. It's gonna happen, is what it is. So the ending thought is really just trade is worth it. As a player, we love trade because it either doesn't impact us at all and we play the game without it, or we play the game because it lets us circumvent grinding. And all we can really hope for in that end is that GGG does not create the unfun parts that I talked about earlier because they're trying to design around trade. They still need to keep the parts that trade allows us to skirt around as a part of the experience that is worthwhile to us as players. Now, before I get out of here, reminder, this game is in early access like a motherfucker. So things are subject to change. The system will inevitably get better. At least it has to get better. They want the game to live out a proper and flourishing life that doesn't make it feel like they, wasted several years of time that they could have just been turning PoE1 into an absolute monster of a game, right? So it will get improvements. I'm pretty sure of it. But I wanted to take some time today just to talk about the, fundamentals of trade and why it has to exist. Because I think as fun as it is to poke at trade for being problematic, trade actually isn't the problem, right? Not in the way that you're making it out to be. That's it. That's all. If you guys enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you want to see more of me in other places, in that not in the comment section, in the description down below, there are links that you can click on. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. There we go. As far as how you feel about what we talked about. And otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.